Are you confident our governments have a real AI strategy?
No. But Southeast Asia runs a risk of becoming just a spectator as opposed to a stakeholder. It's only going to take Indonesia 120 years to modernize and to be fully AI capable.
Our genius from Srivijaya to Malacca has been the position, not the production.
AI is going to only further elitize the pre-existing elitized economic order.
The decision to stop or to cut the contract is made in New Jersey. It's not made in Manila.
We've got computer science students coming out of Stanford not being able to get a job. That's how scary it is. It has become ceremonial, photo ops. There's substance, but there's no substance, to be very candid about it. My God is not your God, but in the meantime, buy my Oppo. Who doesn't think right now that nuclear is the ultimate deterrent? I didn't think that technocracy was going to be a species susceptible to extinction as quickly as it has. It hasn't become extinct yet, but I think it's near extinct.
Southeast Asia is home to 700 million people, 90% of humanity. And by my guests' count, only about 357,000 books have been written about this region, out of something like 150 million books in the whole world. That's a quarter of 1%. And most of them written by people who are not from here. That speaks to his central thesis, that this region punches below its weight. And the worry is that AI entrenches it. Cognitive and financial resources circulate where they've always circulated, and the same shortcomings that kept us peripheral now compound. But there's a second possibility. The technology unsettling the great powers is the same one that they are racing to win. Their positions, even their identities, are being reconfigured in real time. And navigating between large powers in flux is arguably the one thing that this region has done and always done well. I went in with a harder view though. I went in with a view that attracting things has never been our problem. What we've not done as well is keep what arrives. He didn't argue with that. He called it realistic. And then he put a number on why. Indonesia generates about 1,300 kilowatt hours of electricity per person. And he puts the threshold for a modern economy at 10,000. At the current rate of building power stations, closing that gap takes 120 years, which is why he thinks this region risks being a spectator to AI rather than a stakeholder. Energy is one of his two constraints, the other being cognitive capacity. And he returns to it more than any other phrase in the hour that we speak. So when I asked whether governments in this region have a real AI strategy, his answer was one word. My guest is Gita Wirjawan, former Indonesian Trade Minister, formerly of Goldman and JP Morgan, founder of his own fund, and a teacher at Stanford. And for several years now, he's been one of this region's most serious long-form interviewers in his own right. His book is Southeast Asia, What It Takes from Periphery to the Core of Global Consciousness. Give us a 2-minute version of your big thesis as to why we're not central in the global conversation.
This was underpinned by essentially two factors. The first was a recognition that Southeast Asia is just not a great storyteller. It's under-narrated. And this is empirically underpinned by the fact that there is about 375,000 books written about Southeast Asia, most of which written by non-Southeast Asians, in a context of about 150 million books. So for a region with 700 million people, which is about 9% of the world's population, to be narrated to the extent of only 0.267% of all the books available, it's just a mockery. It underlines the point that not only are we not great storytellers, but we're not documenting our stories. And then the second was I felt compelled to actually put down in writing stuff that I've thought about, stuff that I've discussed with people. And I had this inkling that writing was going to be much more difficult than just talking. Talking about a concept, you can do it in about 5 minutes, right? Writing about the same concept, you could still be wrong after 2 to 3 days. And that proved to be a really good exercise in my mind when writing this book.
You speak about a storytelling deficit.
Yeah.
But isn't the case that we do have good stories? I mean, you come from Indonesia, you've got a story about Majapahit, about the revolution. Thailand is a story about being a kingdom that's never been conquered. Vietnam, you could argue, has one of the most inspiring national stories, 1,000 years of not being China. So why don't these stories travel? Is it because it serves a domestic audience and it doesn't really quite resonate with the global audience? Is there something else here?
I think to some extent, as I explained earlier, we're just not very good in documenting our stories. Stories get passed on either vertically or horizontally. The preceding generation writes and tells and relays stories to the succeeding generation, or the current generation horizontalizes the documents of stories, right? If you're a unit as a person, then you cross-pollinate whatever document you've got with a university, with an NGO, with an entrepreneur, with whoever is around you. I don't think that happened in a robust manner, horizontally nor vertically, in the last, I would argue, 2,000 years. We've gotten great civilizations, not just the Majapahits, not just the Siam, the Khmers, but the Sriwijayas, the Shailendras, and all these that would have intersected in the latter part of the first millennium with other great civilizations that would have been manifested in the Tang dynasty in China, the Abbasid dynasty in the Middle East at that time, or the Arabian Peninsula, and of course, the great dynasties of India. Taking it for granted, I think, is another factor. Civilizationally, I think Southeast Asia would have been on the back of how civilizational forces from the Arabian Peninsula, India, and China would have been socialized as opposed to proselytized. Proselytization only took place in the 13th century when the Christian missionaries came over to Indochina and started proselytizing. But before then, it was a high degree of socialization that permeated into the social fabric of many parts of Southeast Asia. And we kind of like got used to the fact that we were a region of peace and stability. And sometimes too much peace and stability puts you in a corner where you don't strive, you don't show hunger and thirst for superlatives.
But there's a potentially a different deficit here, which I think you touched on as well, which is what is known about us in the outside world is written from the outside and is off the outside. Not that we don't have our own Southeast Asian historians writing a historiography that counters any Orientalist gaze. You've got Sartono Tijo in Indonesia writing about autonomous history and centralizing the local perspective. You've got Syed Hussein Alatas demystifying, or rather deconstructing the myth of the lazy native.
Right.
But outside, in the sense that our history tends to be periodized based on somebody else's arrival. Right. Indianization, Islamization, Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, the Japanese, Cold War. Every chapter is almost after somebody else arrived. So we talk about centrality or the core of the global consciousness, but isn't the better term here agency, to ensure that we become a player, not just a prize?
No disagreement. I think that agency is inherent within us, but that agency has not been adequately projected for purposes of many things, one of which is capital allocation, right? The way we've attracted technological capital allocation, attracted economic capital allocation is not near where it should be, right? I mean, just take a look at the FDI. We get about $200 to $230 billion a year, of which Singapore disproportionately gets much more than the others. They get about 100 to 140. Malaysia gets about 10 to 20, 25. Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam each gets the same. Indonesia gets about 30 to 50 billion. So that, I think, speaks of the lack of projection of agency when you know there is about $140 trillion worth of liquidity floating around liberal democracy countries, right? And at the rate that risk premium is rising within those countries, it's inevitably got to be diversified out, but it's not being diversified out to this part of the world. The other, I think, where we're not projecting our agency is how we're not playing the role as much as we should in the context of bridging between China and the West, bridging between Islam and the West. Those are obvious, ostensible key forces that could actually be mediated by the agent through Southeast Asia. And I think this is a reflection of how much more we need to invest in our cognitive capacity. I think within Southeast Asia, cognitively, there's a skewed distribution of cognitive capacity. Singapore, I think, is the highest beneficiary of that. But that needs to be further democratized to the other countries. I think once we have a greater degree of democratization of cognitive capacity within all 11 countries in Southeast Asia, then we can truly manifest the agency, as you aptly pointed out.
I think there's a lot to unpack there, and we'll go through some of those themes in the course of this conversation. This show is about the intersection of technology,
right,
and power. I think what we've just discussed about agency and about making sure your own voice tells your story as opposed to somebody else doing it. There's a contemporary edge to this question because with AI and with large language models, these models are trained on a corpus of information that's overwhelmingly English.
Right.
And where Southeast Asia does appear in it, appears mostly as an object of study and not the author of the study, which is an adjacent to what we've been talking about. So a kid who searches about the Majapahit on LLM might well get an answer that's inspired or basically reflective of Anglo or Dutch scholarship, authorship.
Absolutely.
Would you spend public money to fix this?
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of obvious that history has always been written by the victors, not the non-victors. The onus is on us to rewrite to the extent truthful, to the extent holistic, to the extent accurate. I think there's bias and noise within whatever historical perspectives one might have seen with regards to anything, particularly as it relates to many episodes or, periods within Southeast Asia in the last 2,000 years. As it relates to AI, I think the AI narrative is a beautiful narrative, but Southeast Asia runs a risk of becoming just a spectator as opposed to a stakeholder. And this I think is on the back of two foundational attributes. The first is energy or lack thereof. Out of 11 countries, only 2 countries are electrified at 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita, which I think is a threshold for any nation to be modern and any nation to be embracing the AI narrative fully. Malaysia is only at 5,000 kilowatt hour per capita, Indonesia 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita, Philippines 1,000. All the rest outside Brunei and Singapore are less than 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. So I can talk about Indonesia more specifically. If we were to amp up from 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to 10,000 kilowatt hour per capita, we're going to have to 7x it. And to 7x it, we've got to build about 600,000 megawatts, in addition to the pre-existing 100,000 megawatts. We've only been building 5,000 megawatts per year in the last 20 years. It's only going to take Indonesia 120 years to modernize and to be fully AI capable. So right there, we've got a structural limitation, and this is not unique take a look at the others. Malaysia, less so, but the Cambodias of the world, the Laoses, the Myanmars, even the Philippines of the world, I think they're going to need longer time. So on that basis, we're going to be much more of a spectator as opposed to stakeholder. The second foundational attribute is the lack of producing STEM. This is where Malaysia has been taking the lunch of everybody else's. Malaysia converts about 40 to 43% of its university students into STEM students. Singapore only 36%, Indonesia 22%. All the others basically sub 30. China converts 40%. So when we compare ourselves with China, which I think is increasingly becoming a technological behemoth, they produce about 4.5 million STEM products per year. Southeast Asia, only 750,000 STEM products per year. China has 8 universities that are in the top 10 in the context of research in the world. They've produced 2 universities, generally speaking, that are in the top 20. Southeast Asia, out of 10,000 campuses, half of which is in Indonesia, they produce only 2 campuses in the top 20 in the world, both of which are in Singapore. University Malaya is ranked 56 in the world. That's the 3rd best university in Southeast Asia. So I think if you take a look at these data points, it's staring at you in that we run a risk of becoming a spectator as opposed to a stakeholder of the AI narrative.
I think building on what you've just shared, let me put to you a hyper-realistic on Southeast Asia. Because there's a wisdom, I think, in knowing who you are, where you sit, and what moment you're in. And whatever moment this is, it's not the rules-based order as we understood it. It is a moment that is more contentious, more dangerous. And the hyper-realistic is that the smart move to do is not to fantasize about full-stack sovereignty. It is to realize that, relatively speaking, because the statistics you just shared, and also our history of never really being big creators for the world, our history has been a history of being a node. Our genius from Srivijaya to Malacca has been the position, not the production, as it were. I mean, that could change over time, and we'd like it to change, but not in a time scale that matters today. So maybe the real game is to play the node card more intelligently than we've been doing. Is that me being too small-minded, or is that realistic?
No, I think that's realistic. Now, I mean, you kind of implied upon some geopolitical element here, right? I think realism is something that I've been increasingly embracing. But there's 2 kinds of realism. Realism is basically projection of power for purposes of balance. But there's a new trendy kind of realism where there is a projection of power solely, if not predominantly, for industrialization of the military, right? I don't embrace the latter. I embrace the former. I think balance is the consequence of projection of power. And to the extent that we embrace that premise, then it is intuitively clear that within the next 100 years, China and the West are going to be projecting their geopolitical thrust. And if they do that, it's inevitably going to entail a geopolitical equilibrium for Southeast Asia. Right? We had a historical aberration in the 17th century when the Qing dynasty kind of domesticated. And that created a vacuum, and that vacuum was capitalized upon by the Europeans, as a result of which we went through more than 3 centuries of humiliation. That was kind of preceded by the landing of the Portuguese in Malacca in 1511. Now, in the next 100 years, I think, as a realist, I see a grand opportunity for Southeast Asia to be capitalizing upon this geopolitical equilibrium as a result of the projection of power by both the Chinese and the West. And the capitalization of this is not going to go to the full extent without adequate, if not meaningful, distribution of cognitive capacity. I take the 20-year view. I think within the next 20 years, we're going to be able to actualize whatever vision or aspiration we may have geopolitically.
You hinted at the how, cognitive capacity, but let's talk about the what. What is the 2026 version of the historical nodes that we've implied? What is it about our position that you think translates to this grand opportunity in your words? Is it the fact that we have the land, power, water for compute? Is it that we have testing and packaging for chips in Malaysia, or some raw materials in Indonesia, or the Singapore brand of being the neutral ground for all sides? What is the node here for Southeast Asia?
The raw stuff has been and will always be there, right? The coal, the resources, the people. I think we're going to be able to enjoy demographic dividends for the next 10 years, not for all countries, but for the large-scale countries, namely Philippines and Indonesia. Those two are going to be able to buoy collectively the region. But that's baseline. We have to rebase that with the new raw. The new raw is basically the cognitive capacity. I can't dwell on this enough. You've got some countries that have an average IQ of 78.49. You've got one that's got 105. That educational or intellectual divergence, I think, has ostensibly entailed in economic divergence. And I think economic divergence exposes one to vulnerability, as we're seeing evolution as it relates to geopolitics, climate, and economics in a much more exponential manner. The vulnerability is only going to increase. Now, the third would be peace and stability, which is sine qua non for any kind of economic development. You're not going to be able to grow economically without peace and stability. And this is something that I've always shared with anybody I meet, that, we've only shed the blood of no more than 9 million people in the last 2,000 years on the back of differences of views or opinions as it relates to race, sovereignty, ethnicity, and or religion, compared to Europe, which shed the blood of more than 180 million lives in the same duration of 2,000 years, of which more than 100 million lives were lost in the first two world wars in the early part of the 20th century. So those three factors, the raw in terms of resources and people, the raw that's rebased, meaning distribution or further distribution of cognitive capacity, and the third, basically the third raw, which is peace and stability, I think will allow us to rebase.
This peace and stability point, this gets to something that is quite concrete about the strategy of our region. And the story we've told ourselves about how we should approach great power competition. Be friendly to all sides, to both sides. President Prabowo has this saying, right? Was it one enemy is too many and 1,000 friends is too few? Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, I remember saying a few months ago that, looking for win-win outcomes and wanting to work with all major powers, even if they have problems between themselves. If you look at the statements of leaders in Malaysia, Vietnam, you'll find similar remarks about equidistance. But we seem to be operating in a new game with new rules. Washington's tariff framework and chip restrictions appear to be getting stronger, not weaker. And Beijing is watching. They've made remarks about no deal at the expense of China will go unreciprocated in some form. It feels like this window of playing both sides, as it were, is closing. Are we being too comfortable trying to strike a bargain that's really not there anymore?
We have entered multipolarity in a big way. Within multipolarity, there has been and there will be revisionism coming from BRICS, coming from non-BRICS countries. Beyond BRICS, you're looking at Nigeria, Turkey, Mexico. Indonesia has just joined BRICS. We're one of the new 5 beyond the first 5 of BRICS or BRICS Plus. If we believe in that kind of revisionism, then you've got to take a look at how the U.S. has somewhat failed in campaigning upon its liberal values globally, because they've been campaigning all across the world with a bit too much of universalism. My God is your God, with no recognition of primacy and supremacy of culture and sovereignty. China has gone through what the Chinese have called the 3 phases, right? The first would have been the revolution, cleansing their soul in 1949 from the nationalist ideology, embracing socialism and communism. Then they went on this big bandwagon in 1978, which they called the infusion phase. Massive capacity building, sending more than 9 million talents all across the world, most of which studied STEM, most of which came back. This is what referred to as brain circulation. Now they've been vomiting to all of us BYDs, Xiaomi's, Oppos, which the world over consumes. And the third phase that they're about to go through is really re-globalizing, but with pluralism. My God is not your God, but in the meantime, buy my Oppo, right? That's the kind of pragmatism that China will embark upon. I think that's intuitively likely to resonate more to the global south. We belong, well, you're almost leaving the global south because your GDP per capita is nearing 14,000. But 84% of the global community belongs to the global south. That's 7 billion people, including Indonesia and the others in Southeast Asia. I think the world will be looking at how the West is going to have to recalibrate its means of globalizing or re-globalizing versus how China is going to re-globalize. I think as long as each one of them will be able to re-globalize with pluralism, we will be a big beneficiary of this. To the extent one does less than the other, it's obvious where we're going to go. That, I think, is the posturing for Southeast Asia going forward. But it doesn't discount the need or the fact that Southeast Asia must improve upon its pre-existing geopolitical dexterity. We have not projected enough geopolitical dexterity. And that, I think, again, goes back to the early foundation we talked about, cognitive capacity.
What is that improved posturing for Southeast Asia?
Look, I think the political economy argument with respect to the Chinese, when they're building a BYD plant in Penang, is that there's got to be a minimum percentage for local content purposes. There's got to be technological transfer to the Malaysians, to Malaysia. And if Oppo were to build a factory in Vietnam or anywhere else, there's got to be a technological transfer so that the Vietnamese, the Malaysians, and all the others in Southeast Asia will move up the value chain, will move up the global geopolitical order, will be able to expand upon their pre-existing strategic autonomy. And I think the Chinese are likely to increasingly buy that argument because if they don't, there's going to be blowback. You saw that in Malaysia a few years ago, right? Socially, economically, politically, and geopolitically. And they have consciously pivoted from the West or from the U.S. If you take a look at their trade to the U.S. as a ratio to trade to the rest of the world or to the whole world, it used to be at about 23 to 24%. It's dwindled to about 12%. So they've made a conscious effort to pivot to the global south. Despite that, they still enjoyed a bigger surplus last year. Went up from $1 trillion of surplus in 2024 to $1.2 trillion worth of surplus in 2025. So I think China will work extra hard in permeating into the global south on the back of hopefully not just economic interdependence, but hopefully technological interdependence. So the posturing going forward is that we've got to be able to move up the value chain, with which we're going to be able to move up the global geopolitical order. Now, the West has got to recognize this posturing. To the extent they don't, I think they're just going to snooze into the shadow, just being an economic capital allocator. But I do believe they're still great at 0 to 1 technologically. It's just too darn expensive for the global South. So they'll have to rework their narrative to make sure that the goods and services are going to get cheaper. And that can only come with better supply chain capability. Look, China and the US, I think they're competing at all fronts, right? Whether it's quantum, robotics, genetics, AI, energy transition, and all that good stuff. I think what differentiates China is that China has got entrepreneurialism, which the US has. China has got policy, which the US has to some extent. There is some policy paralysis. The third, which is called supply chain. This is what nobody in the world has. And it's tough to emulate. And that, I think, is going to put China ahead of the others for quite some time.
My sense, Gita, is the West appears to be, for a multitude of reasons, unable, unwilling, for now, to shift its view to be a bit closer to how you and I see the world, or really the global majority sees the world. The question and the mystery for me is not what the West does. It's more what China does. Because I think you pointed out a absolutely important point about how China needs to be aware of the bargain it needs to give to the global majority, to Southeast Asia. Even if it is for the moment able to build everything on its own or export everything lock, stock and barrel into your Oppo plant or your BYD plant, that for the long term, it needs to realize that it has, in its own interests, to involve local supply chains.
I went to China 8 times last year to give talks. I spent time with policy elites, academic elites, entrepreneurial elites. I think this narrative is resonating slowly but surely. Because China, they have this ability to look into the long game. And I think they understand that the long game truly means their partners being able to move up the global chain, global value chain, without which they're going to hit a brick wall, socially, economically, and politically within the destination. We saw episodes of such blowback in Africa. We saw a bit of that in Malaysia. And I think if they want to basically collaborate with the global South for the next 20 to 30 years at least, they've got to take that into account. And I think it's going to be win-win more than win-lose, because, it's only going to expand the size of the cake collectively, and the dividends will accrue to all sides. This is something that I'm hopeful for, but this is something that I'm hopeful also for purposes of reminding the West that they've got to recalibrate, they've got to reset. Look, I don't think they're going to be able to continue with the kind of universalism that we've seen in the last few decades in the context of globalization. And they understand that multipolarity is characteristic of proliferation. But, at the end of the day, they've got to make some cookies, right? They've got to basically make some money. And if they want to make money the old-fashioned way, they've got to recalibrate. They can't make money the old-fashioned way doing the old-fashioned way. So I think they understand that they don't have the supply chain capability. They've got tremendous entrepreneurialism. Here's what I notice in the difference between the kind of entrepreneurialism you see in Shenzhen versus that in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, has great universities, so there's research that backs up entrepreneurship. You go to Shenzhen, there's not a great university. The great universities are in Shanghai and Beijing. You got Fudan in Shanghai, you got Tsinghua in Peking. But people that are working in Shenzhen, they're actually migrants. They migrated from Wuhan, Chongqing, Chengdu, Beijing, Shanghai. If they would have worked 9 hours a day in Wuhan, when they go to Shenzhen, they're going to work their butt off for 14, 15 hours with the idea of making products or goods and services cheaper, better, and faster. That's the kind of entrepreneurialism that you're seeing. So the work hard culture is so much more prominent in Shenzhen as opposed to other places.
I intimated earlier that I wasn't extremely hopeful about the West's capability to adjust. But I don't want my comment earlier to preclude a case for why I might be wrong. Is there a case where the West actually adjusts and actually surprises us, that it's able to posture and recalibrate, as you say, to become a partner again of credibility?
I mean, just take a look at what's happening in the Middle East. It's a wake-up call, right? Who would have thought that Iran was going to withstand more than a week? But they've clearly proven themselves to be somewhat of a fourth superpower. I mean, they've been hanging around for 4 months, right? I think there is a recognition among some elites in the U.S. that, you know, everybody else is not as vulnerable as they might have thought in the last 30 years, right? That hopefully will entail some sort of a recalibration. And they understand that proliferation, paradoxically, is more evident within a multipolar world. Proliferation of nuclear, proliferation of other stuff. So if we believe in the premise that proliferation is only going to intensify, it requires greater geopolitical dexterity. Without that kind of dexterity, you're not going to be able to reap the benefit of proliferation. Coming back to nuclear, I mean, who doesn't think right now that nuclear is the ultimate deterrent? I mean, if you're a Korean, if you're a Japanese, with your THAAD interceptor missile capability imminently being relocated to the Middle East, it creates vulnerability for the Koreans instantaneously. So the idea of relying upon the patronage of a great power doesn't necessarily entail sustenance, geopolitically speaking. So that I think is going to entail intuitively proliferation.
It's coming back to Southeast Asia, picking up on something you said 5 minutes ago around the bargain that perhaps in this case China can make with Southeast Asia and the geopolitical dexterity and playing our hand better as this region. Your book makes attraction the centerpiece of what Southeast Asia should do as well. Attract capital, attract investment, attract talent. But I want to put to you that attraction per se hasn't been our biggest problem. If you look at FDI numbers, especially from a couple of years ago, we were the top developing region in terms of FDI inflow. And this is not shallow attraction either. You've got Intel, a quarter of their revenues originate from ASEAN. So attraction isn't our biggest problem. It's how we absorb what we attract so that we build something that lasts and outlasts the capital and talent that come through. In Malaysia, we had this vision to build a Silicon Valley. In 1996, we launched the multimedia super corridor. We gave tax holidays, a bill of guarantees, 10 promises, all policies to attract investors. 30 years on, it's done some good, but it's not Silicon Valley. It is shared services and data center park. And if that's unfair, then look at other yardsticks that bear this broader point out. You've got less than 40 unicorns for a population of 700 million, compared to the US and China that count theirs in the hundreds. You've got South Korea with 50 million people filing international patents an order of magnitude more than this entire region. And if we look at the companies that are big in this region, they're banks, they're energy companies, palm oil, conglomerates, very little new economy, very little of what the world runs on. So attraction's not an issue, but what haven't we been able to do well enough so that we could attract FDI and then absorb it into homegrown innovation?
But capital allocation hinges on two foundational factors. The first is rule of law. It can't be rule of lawyers, right? If you say it's going to be blue today, it better be blue tomorrow, next week, a month later, 10 years from now, right? That's the kind of predictability that an investor or capital allocator wants. I think Singapore has proven to be really good at that. This is something that I think needs to be emulated by all the other 10 countries. The second is what I call translational wherewithal. How do you translate from uncertainties to risks? Uncertainties are unknown unknowns. Risks are known unknowns. You can price risks. You can quantify risks, but you can't price uncertainties, right? If somebody in anywhere in Southeast Asia were to be confronted by a potential investor from anywhere around the world, he or she could utter, there is a 58% probability that there's going to be a blackout for about a month and a half every year. When that happens, your top line is going to come down 18%. Your bottom line is going to come down 12%. When that happens, your IRR unlevered is going to be 22%, levered 28%. Imagine if everybody of the 700 million people in Southeast Asia were to be able to assign probabilistic scenario on anything. You've just moved or shifted away from uncertainty to risk. But if the capital allocator meets up somebody in Southeast Asia and that person says, Inshallah, there's not going to be a blackout, you've just differentiated the narrative from a risk, proposition to an uncertainty proposition. So how do you educate people to be able to translate from uncertainties to risks? STEM. This is where you take out the lunch from everybody else's, because you're converting. If you're the CEO of Intel, NVIDIA, and all these big guys, when they want to allocate capital, they look at PISA scores. Singapore is number one in the world, number one in Southeast Asia, of course. Vietnam now is number 2 in Southeast Asia, number 30 in the world. Malaysia, unfortunately, is not above the global average. Indonesia is number 69 out of 81 countries. Then you take a look at the STEM conversion. This is where you win out. So this is why the big guys from Silicon Valley and China, the tech guys, are deploying capital, quite meaningfully to Malaysia. So I think the idea of distributing this best practice to the Laoses of the world, to the Myanmars of the world, to the Bruneis of the world, to the Indonesias of the world is not a bad idea, given the fact, as much as you'd think that $200 to $230 billion of FDI per year sounds like a lot of money, there's $140 trillion worth of liquidity that's just financialized. It's sitting in capital markets in the West. It needs to be diversified out. It needs to go as smart capital for people to move up the value chain and hopefully earn good IRR. That's going to happen, I think, in the next 10 to 20 years once they see us investing in our cognitive capacities.
I want to close out this section, Gita, with again trying to speak about this question of nodes and absorbing what you've just described, again stressing on education and cognitive capacity. But on this question of nodes, it just dawned on me that not all nodes are created equal. On the one hand, you can host very important economic activity in your backyard, gain very relatively little from it, and be none the more secure for it. The case of Philippines comes to mind. Tens of billions of dollars in revenue, nearly 2 million jobs, built entirely on delivering services to foreign firms, no IP. And then there are different kinds of nodes that feel a bit more resilient. So Penang, you've got thousands of firms, a real local supply chain ecosystem. Or Singapore seems to be deliberately putting the frontier or bringing frontier AI companies into the region, into their country, and making sure that talent circulates through them, engineers are trained. So how do we build more of the second kind of nodes that actually build resilience and not mistake being a host with genuinely being defensible?
I hate to sound like a broken record, But I think democratizing education is going to increase the collective note as opposed to the individual note. Philippines is exposed to history with the Americans, right? But Philippines has been known also as, they call it, undertaking strategic oscillation, depending on who's in a position of leadership. For some 6 years, if the leadership is pro-China, they go to China. But for the subsequent 6 years, if the leadership is pro-US, they go to the US and do anything to basically push out the Chinese, right? So the way to make this more collective, I had one idea. I mean, ASEAN as an organization has been beautiful in promoting the 3 pillars, right? Socioculture, economics, and political stability. But I think it needs to have some degree of supranationalism. I'm not trying to equate that with the EU as it relates to immigration, monetary policy, and all that good stuff. I just want to propose that it has some degree of supranationalism as it relates to education. There's no reason for ASEAN not to be able to tell all 11 countries, dude, why don't you copycat what Finland has? Why don't you copycat what Singapore has? And I'll give you a differential timeline. Indonesia, you take 9 years. Thailand, you take 8 years. Whatever. So that we're going to be at equal level, relatively speaking. That, I think, is going to entail a lot more collective behavior and agency, as opposed to individualizing the notes. I don't think it's going to happen without the recognition that educational divergence has and will likely correlate with economic divergence. So the onus is on us to socialize this up. If we keep praying and burning the candles, the top-down type of behavior is going to happen, forget it. I think we've got to bottom up it culturally, that this has to be part of the conversation, whether you're at school, at the office, at the place of worship, or any kind of social institution, that this kind of supranationalism is good because it only relates to education. It doesn't relate to politics. It doesn't relate to culture. Because if we keep relying on the individual leadership of a country amongst all 11, to basically get their act together on PISA, get their act together on STEM conversion, it'll take a long time.
I'm sure you'll agree that even if you make it narrow and focus on education, everything from nationalism to our differentiated history will make this a really tall order.
Yeah, no doubt. No disagreement.
Gotta try.
But we're talking about what it takes, right, for us to shine in the future. I think... Look, let's hope that, each individual leadership recognizes what needs to be remedied. But I think some degree of supranationalism might help or could help. And this is what I've been referring to as the reduction of the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity has been beautiful. Granted, we've been able to be peaceful and stable, relatively speaking. But I think peace and stability are not enough. For us to not only economically develop, but to be able to move up the value chain.
I think it begins with the people. It begins not just with the politicians, but the people itself in our region.
Yeah.
To actually want to do this. And truth be told, can't speak with much authority about Indonesia, but in Malaysia, save for the pride in hosting the ASEAN summit last year, ASEAN is not front and center of people's minds. And that's something I think we all need to fix.
It has become ceremonial. Photo ops. There's substance, but there's no substance. To be very candid about it. And I think, you started the conversation with agency. And the agency needs to be collective. It can't be individual. You started talking about notes. The note has to be collective. And that could only be on the back of sheer democratization of cognitive capacity. And we've got to recognize that there is disparity in cognitive capacity within all 11 countries. And to the extent we just keep shutting that out, I don't think, problem resolution starts with problem recognition.
Let's move the conversation along to AI.
Okay.
All of this talk before nodes, absorption, defensibility, cognitive capacity becomes all the more urgent with the AI revolution. I'm sure you'll agree, because it's the mother of all disruptions. The opportunities are real, the risks are also real. Are you confident our governments have a real AI strategy?
No.
Say a bit more.
I alluded to the notion that there has been anachronistic regulatory oversight in many countries, including developed countries, where the regulators don't even understand what questions to ask. And the regulators being 73 years old, asking a 27-year-old who is master of the universe as it relates to AI. And then the 27-year-old is just having a ball on the other side of the table. I like it. I can take advantage of this anachronistic regulatory oversight. And that's characteristic of many countries around the world, many countries in Southeast Asia. So I think that needs to be remedied, right? But there is a systemic impediment to how this potential manipulation could take place. The systemic impediment is the lack of energy, right? To the extent we have less energy, things are going to move at a slow speed. Look, energy is absolutely required if we want to create nonlinearity. Nonlinearity like a DeepSeek moment. We've got to be a creator of an AI, an LLM, right? But to the extent we don't have enough energy, AI is going to only further elitize the pre-existing elitized economic order. I've talked about how the internet has elitized the world, economically speaking. You're seeing increasing Gini coefficient ratio as it relates to wealth and income. You're seeing increasing centripetalism as opposed to centrifugality. Economic development takes place better, faster in primary cities as opposed to secondary cities, as much less villages. So these are, I think, manifestations of how the democratization of information has not led up to commensurate democratization of ideas, commensurate democratization of capital, commensurate democratization of any public goods including intellect, education, welfare, healthcare, social value, moral value. Darren Acemoglu, I think, made the argument in his book, Power and Progress, that the median income of the U.S. went up every year by 2.5% from 1945 until 1973. Thereafter, the internet became ubiquitous. Guess what? The median income in the U.S. went up by only a factor of 0.45% per year. So that, I think, underlines my point that democratization of ideas and capital have not taken place on the back of technological innovation. Now, imagine AI, which is going to be in the hands of a few that have access to energy, that have access to capital. It's only going to inevitably further elitize. So do I sound dystopian? Somewhat, especially for Southeast Asia, right? So I long for a future where I think there could be someone from Johor, someone from Malang, someone from Cebu, someone from Ho Chi Minh who could actually create nonlinearity like a DeepSeek moment. But he or she is going to have to be backed by adequate energy and an adequate STEM wisdom. I don't think we're there yet.
I think I love your phrase, nonlinearity. And AI promises to bring that potential to developing regions, kind of jump the queue, as it were. But I think your dystopian or bear case has a basis to it. And I guess in the political economy bargain of governments and countries in this region, everyone has to figure out how they play this deck of cards. And when it comes to elitizing or further elitizing the economic order, one thing becomes quite totemic, which is job displacement. There's emerging evidence that job displacement may be slowed down because politicians and governments will not allow it to happen. Do you think that is a sustainable, well, it's a rhetorical question. How long do you think Southeast Asian governments, if it does adopt this approach, can slow it down before inevitability happens?
Well, you started out with the BPO analysis in the Philippines, right? 2 million jobs are at risk. I mean, whatever they do is at risk of being dislocated. And the dislocation is not on the back of the political leadership in the Philippines. It's on the back of the wishes of the entrepreneurs beyond the Philippines. So that's systemic, right? So the Filipinos, I think, will have to figure out how to BPO AI the narrative, right? And the Philippines, I think, has been known in Southeast Asia as the greatest, if not some of the greatest service providers. Globally speaking, you go to a hotel in Dubai, you never get bad service from a Filipino. I'm quoting someone here. And then you go to anywhere, you never get bad service from a Filipino, right? So they've got to rethink how the service is going to be provided on the back of an AI platform. And I think the political leadership, if it is within her or his control, to the extent that he or she recognizes a social blowback by way of the advancement of an AI narrative, will inevitably slow things down for political wisdom purposes. Now, I've spent a bit of time in the Silicon Valley for the last few years. What I've noticed, the ideology or the philosophy of the pre-existing LLMs has shifted on two accounts. Number one, they've shifted from nonprofit to for-profit. They've shifted from open source to closed source. As a developing country member, as a Global South member, I like to think that I think for all of us in the Global South, what resonates better is cheap and better. And that inevitably requires open source, requires not-for-profit. And this is where China has been more dogged. DeepSeek so far has been dogged about being open source and not-for-profit.
Let's see whether they keep that posture when they become really the frontier.
Exactly. So far, I said, right? So they might change their mind. But anybody out there that has created non-linearity that's insistent on staying open source is absolutely going to resonate to the Global South. And then keep in mind, there's only 7 billion people within the Global South out of the 8 billion people on Earth. So if I were a non-linear, entrepreneur, I would like to, collaborate with the 7 billion people for as long as possible. Now, in order to do that, I've got to make sure that I stay open source and I've got to stay as little profit or as non-profit as possible. That, I think, will sustain. And that's going to help the political leadership within the Global South to figure out how to transition from a non-AI to an AI narrative.
Perhaps in some ways, it's not in the gift of Southeast Asian governments to entirely slow the impact down. The BPO example is instructive of this because in Ohio, you can slow it down because it's domestic jobs, subject to domestic political economy bargain. But if you're in the Philippines, the decision to stop or to cut the contract is made in New Jersey. It's not made in Manila. So that's a real awakening for Southeast Asian governments to really think through how it plays its hand when it comes to this. And perhaps then your macro point, if I understand it correctly, is to work with what we have and perhaps convince the Chinese to stay open source, making sure that we can open source or open weights, making sure that we can build something meaningful from what is available to us quickly so that the elitism concerns that you put out doesn't come to bear. Would that be a fair way to...
Absolutely. Look, I mean, AI at the end of the day is hallucination. It hinges on hypnosis. If the hypnosis comes from a guy with an IQ of 78, the hallucination is not going to be as good quality as the hallucination coming out of a hypnosis, coming from a guy with an IQ of 140. Right. So we've got to make sure that the IQ of everybody in Southeast Asia goes up, hopefully to 140, but 100 would be a great mark. Right. So that we're going to have good hallucination in order to prevent a cataclysmic scenario, in order to prevent a dystopian prospect. Right. So, and number two, we've got to amp up on the energy. And we've got to speed up. I mean, let's go back to Indonesia. If we're only building 5,000 megawatts, we're not going to get there in time. It'll take us 120 years. But let's say if we build 30,000 megawatts in order to go up from 100 gig to 700 gigawatts, we're going to need only 20 years. I'm a lot happier with that because the kids and grandkids of our generation will be able to enjoy the AI narrative. And as long as their IQ goes up, the energy goes up within the next 20 years, I think they're going to be able to figure out a way to basically shy away from a dystopia to a utopia or a relative utopia. And utopia can't just be, good and fluffy, but it's got to be manifested in sheer democratization of public goods.
To the extent that job displacements do happen on the way to this utopia, this outcome that we dream of for this region with regards to its AI strategy, the one finding that keeps coming up is that young people, entry-level jobs, are the ones most at risk.
Yeah.
How does one go from junior to senior when the junior itself is the one being displaced?
I don't know. I mean, I think the future will be thick with a McKinsey AI, a JP Morgan AI. Everything has got to be AI'd. And at the rate that the narrative is shifting so quickly from generative to agentic, whoever doesn't catch up with this is going to be sitting in the old McKinsey, in the old JP Morgan mold, right? And I'm not suggesting the extinction of McKinsey and JP Morgan here. I think they are in a process of repurposing, remolding, right? So any narrative out there has got to be AI. And look, generally speaking, all across Southeast Asia, you're seeing this sad trends of the portion of manufacture to GDP declining. Countries in Philippines, Indonesia, we used to have, manufacture to GDP ratios of around 30%. Now it's sub 20%. We used to have agriculture to GDP ratios of about 20%. Now it's like in the low teens. Indonesia is about 13, 14%. At the benefit or at the expense of increase in service, right? I'm okay if the service relates to nano, AI, but the service, unfortunately, stays at the bottom echelon of the value chain. All these, I think, could be remedied, right? With the augmentation of AI on agriculture, augmentation of AI on manufacture, augmentation of AI on service. You can flip the narrative. You can upend the narrative in such a way that we could go back to the old days where perhaps agriculture could go back up to 20, 25% of the GDP and manufacture could go back from 18, 19% to 30%. Then you've got services, above 50%, but these are services that are in the top echelon of the value chain. And I think every element of your GDP equation could be AI'd meaningfully without meaningful dislocation. But it requires good thinking by the leadership.
You see, Pak Gita, when you and I use AI, and we'd like to think we use it well, I think part of the reason that I can use it well is because of the years of experience that I had in my 20s, in my 30s, doing work before AI came around, having that baseline knowledge which is somewhere in my brain and translates in the way I prompt and translates in the way I imagine my use of AI. Absent that, how does the 20-year-old go into the job market?
AI is a beneficiary of anything that's gotten codified, right? If just intuitively, right? If I were a student, freshman year, I would like to profess in anything that's not been codified, or I would like to profess in anything that's least codified for me to not be exposed to displacement, right? And I think that's the way to think. And we've got computer science students coming out of Stanford not being able to get a job. That's how scary it is, because what they're intending to profess has already been codified. If it's been codified, it's documented and it's swept by the AI. So I think intuitively the way to think forward is to profess in anything that's less codified. That could be a good way to, socialize to the young kids, as for them not to feel too scared. And the good thing about Southeast Asia is, as I said earlier, we've only gotten 375,000 books.
The only way is up.
So it's a systemic remedy that we haven't gotten too many things codified or documented. At the rate that we're less documented, we're less codified, it's a buffer for us to profess in as many things as possible.
It's an optimistic take that I appreciate. Let's just drawing to a close. Gita, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I think I counted at least four times you mentioned the word cognitive capacity.
7. Just kidding.
You're probably correct. Open-ended question. What do we need to do here to fix this problem?
Collectively, I go back to the ASEAN rechartering. I think without supranationalism, we can hope for serendipity, that there is a great leadership in every one of the 11 countries, recognizing the problem, recognizing the steps that need to be taken. Absent which, supranationalism.
But when it comes to AI, Gita, how would you change education in this region to make it AI ready and AI proof?
Well, you're not going to be, look, I mean, the simple counterexample would be to have a smart AI, right? A smart teacher in Jakarta being helped by an AI, and he or she talks to about 120, 130 cities, right? And there's got to be interaction, which is well documented by the AI, well filtered by the AI, well reformulated by the AI, well recommended and everything else. Because Indonesia has got 3.5 million teachers, most of which make only less than $200 a month. The better talents would want to work for Meta, Google, Danantara, right? Because they'll make $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month. So one remedy to that is to implement an AI that enables a great teacher, one or few or many of those 3.5 million teachers, to basically democratize education to as many people as possible. And if that were to succeed, that could certainly be emulated in all the other developing economies in Southeast Asia. I think that's the short term. The long term, again, I go back to supranationalism as it relates to AI. I think the supranationalism has to be clear cut about how education, pedagogy, academic curricula in all 11 countries have to infuse the teachings of AI, without which then we're not going to be relevant. Yeah.
I think you mentioned a lot in your last answer about how we can use AI to overcome some of the structural deficiencies in our education attainment. smart AI.
Right.
I think those are ideas that are worth exploring. What I'd like to ask again, though, is what about the curricula and what about the way we teach? Should we think about adjusting or changing in light of what AI now brings, which is the commoditization of knowledge or codified knowledge, as you described earlier? Do we still need to teach the same thing? Do some things really become less important to be taught? Have you had any ideas around that?
Yeah, I look, I'm a product of liberal arts and also STEM to some extent. I do believe as much as we have to put premium on STEM education, this is not zero sum. I think education and liberal arts is important, and I'm a believer of late specialization, not early specialization. I don't believe 100% what Malcolm Gladwell advocated in the Outliers book. I'm a much bigger believer of what David Epstein advocated in the book called The Range, which is really about late specialization. You go through a number of dimensions, then you specialize at the end. Broadening your horizon, I think, allows you to anticipate blind spot. Broadening your horizon, I think, allows you to help mitigate systemic risks better, as opposed to being an early specializer. There's so many stuff, in a blind spot, and I think you've got to be able to anticipate that. At the rate that so few books have been written about Southeast Asia, and I think it's high time to basically learn STEM and liberal arts. I think that's going to position the kid really robustly in the future, in a future of AI.
Our last question, Pak Gita. Anything that you've changed your mind on recently or anything that surprised you recently?
I didn't think that technocracy was going to be a species susceptible to extinction as quickly as it has. I think the selection of talent in many countries around the world has been on the back of too much patronage and or loyalty, as opposed to meritocracy. It hasn't become extinct yet, but I think it's near extinct. And I think it's high time for that surprise to be used as capital to recoup, regroup, reset, recalibrate.
Gita Wirjawan, thank you.
Thanks, Shahril.